Hello, this is Julia Gamelina of Madam Architect, and you're listening to U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. Today, you'll meet two CEOs, not one but two, of HOK, one of the most successful architecture firms in the world. That will be past CEO Patrick MacLeamy and current CEO Bill Hellmuth. HOK designed hundreds of major projects you know around the world, like the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum in D.C., Apple's first major campus in Cupertino, California, the George Bush Presidential Library in Texas, and Orioles Park in Baltimore. And then there's the Bull Durham Athletic Park in North Carolina, close to home for us, the amazing Udvar-Hazy Air and Space Museum out near Dulles in D.C., and DFW Airport in Dallas. But wait, there's more. Dubai Marina in Dubai, where U.S. Modernist is going for the now 2021 World Expo. And last but not least, the renovation of Joe Biden's least favorite airport, LaGuardia. And now the guy who printed up his own Bjarke Ingels face mask. That would be George Smart.
Hi, folks. It's early May here in the studio, which is a combination of Tom in the actual studio and me at home, cobbling together equipment like a scout working on his electronic merit badge. It's kind of like Apollo 13, where the astronauts have to pull out all the items in the capsule, plus duct tape, to make things work.
Except not as life-threatening.
Right, yeah. My desk is a sea of cords, but Tom and I have tested it, and the good news is we have enough content completed and on the way to take us through the summer and fall. Today, I want to thank everyone who's been participating in our giveaways all this last month on Facebook and Instagram. We've been giving away books and DVDs and t-shirts and grocery bags and magnets to people all over America. It's so great to know you like the show and are so enthusiastic with comments and suggestions. Support for U.S. Modernist Radio comes from Modernist Realtor Angela Roll and Nichiha.com/US Modernist.
Durability, designed to last for years to come, bringing you peace and tranquility. You feel relaxed, knowing your house can easily achieve any exterior look and any color. Wood, concrete. Your house loves feeling this good, and you love feeling this good. Nichiha, Nichiha. Nichiha, Nichiha. Say it with me. Nichiha. Advanced engineering. Nichiha, Nichiha. Durability, textures, finishes, and colors. Visit Nichiha.com/US Modernist. Nichiha, Nichiha. Nichiha. That's N. C H I H. Wait for it. A look you'll love. Nichiha.
Patrick MacLeamy earned degrees in architecture from the Toast of Illinois, Champaign. Who wrote this? And he joined HOK in 1967 as the firm's very first office in St. Louis. He relocated to San Francisco in 1970 to help establish HOK's first regional office, and by 1983 he was managing principal of the San Francisco office. He joined the firm's executive committee in 1995 and became chief operating officer in 2000. He became CEO in 2003, and in retirement he's got a new book, designing a world-class architecture firm, the people, stories, and strategies behind HOK. Welcome, Patrick.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Bill Hellmuth is current CEO of HOK, succeeding Patrick, and also runs the Washington, D.C. office. He studied near us at UVA and later with Michael Graves at Princeton. Bill's uncle, George Hellmuth, started the firm as Hellmuth, Yamazaki, and Lineweber. Is that how it is? Lineweber?
Lineweber.
In 1949, with the great Minoru Yamazaki, who we've profiled on past shows. And that firm became Hellmuth, Obata, and Casaubon in 1955. Thankfully, HOK has not diddled with their partner names since then, like so many firms do, and that has contributed to its long-term successful reputation and brand recognition. Every architecture student in the world knows HOK, and it's one of the largest design firms ever with 1,800 team members. Welcome, Bill.
Well, thank you. Good to be here.
Yeah, glad to have you both with us. It's an unusual privilege to have two such high-ranking members of the architecture community.
Well, we're both sheltering in place at our various homes on either coast, so it's easy to find us right now.
Yeah, people are available, aren't they?
And we're all learning new skills on various messaging platforms.
That's true, too.
Well, I'll tell you what the real problem is some of them are actually quite good at sketching when you're giving a presentation. But every single one, the sketched icon is in a completely different and hidden and non-intuitive location.
Don't you hate that?
So you have to sort of relearn each one as it kind of rolls at you.
Yep. My wife is a first grade elementary school teacher, and she was working with some kids on Google Meet, I think, the other day, first graders helping them read, and she couldn't find a button, and the first grader showed her how to hold a mouse over a particular spot on the screen, and all of a sudden an icon appeared. Everyone is different. You're right.
Yeah.
Bill, let's start with you. I noticed that when you got out of school, you didn't go to work for HOK right away. You went to work with really one of their biggest competitors, Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill, who we did a show about a couple of weeks ago. And one of your first projects there was a building at 780 3rd Avenue. How did that building shape your career?
Well, it was interesting. Actually, that was probably the first building I worked on that required elevators. I mean, it was a 50-story building in Midtown Manhattan. What really was, for me, what was wonderful about it is it was a very complicated client structure. And so I got a chance to really understand what they were all about and how to work on a building that would suit their zoning needs and their building needs and all of that. But what came out of it, because of a very strange thing in the zoning process, we had to get it permitted by a certain date, which produced this very, very skinny, very, very tall building. And in order to make it even stand up, because relatively it was skinnier and taller, its aspect ratio was tougher than the World Trade Centers. I got a chance to work with Dr. Fazler Khan, who was absolutely brilliant, and part of the group of structural engineers that really helped shape what the contemporary skyscraper was all about. He did Sears Tower, he did John Hancock. And from that, what I learned was the whole approach to collaborating on a building to use the systems, the building techniques, and the client's needs all to come together in a very single, simple, and elegant structure.
And is that the predecessor to some of the super talls we're seeing now going up in New York?
It's part of a generation. There were a couple other buildings that were happening at about the same time, and out of those came the idea that you'd have these tiny floor plates and reach for the sky. And using high-strength concrete, they weren't able to use high-strength concrete in the same way prior to this generation of buildings. But yes, it very much was a part of that.
And when was this building built?
Oh, I'll give you the wrong dates, but it's the early 80s.
Okay.
So you would have been, what, 28, 30, somewhat around then?
I was probably 26, 27 when I worked on that one. It was a heady time. It was during what I called the Tower and Hour days. New York was booming, and kids like me got an opportunity to work on stuff that we really had no right to work on, but it all somehow worked out.
Patrick, a question for you, going back a little earlier in the history of HOK. Yeah. Asian Americans were really at the forefront of design in the 1950s. Gio Obata, who's still with us, Minoru Yamazaki, and our own George Matsumoto were at the top of their game. Yet there wasn't much recognition of this at the time by the industry, right?
Well, I think that's true. Everybody called him Yama except Gio. Gio called Yama Mr. Yamasaki. But each one had, I would say, because they were both Japanese American, both Yamasaki and Obata were Nisei, which is the firstborn generation in this country from Japanese immigrant parents. They didn't know each other until Yamasaki hired Gio to work for the predecessor firm to HOK, Yamasaki and Lineweber. And they discovered they were both Nisei, they were both first generation, and each one had his own particular challenge. By far, the biggest challenge was for Obata. Gio didn't grow up in the Midwest, neither did Yama. Yama grew up in the Seattle area and found his way to New York, was working for someone, I don't know that part of the story, but was recruited by George Hellmuth, the founder of HOK, to work for the firm that Hellmuth was working for at the time, Smith, Hinchman and Grills, the predecessor to what is today the Smith Group. That was in Detroit. And they did a lot of work for the automobile companies. A lot of it was designing big assembly plants and factory-type buildings. Obata, who was about 10 years younger, grew up in Berkeley, and his father and mother were both artists and artisans. His father is a very noted landscape painter, and Akira Obata eventually joined the faculty at UC Berkeley, the art faculty, but he painted in the summers up at Yosemite, and became very close friends with Ansel Adams, the famous photographer.
Sure.
So Obata, Gio Obata, the son, his parents both thought he would become an artist like they were, but he was good at math and science, and with his mother's encouragement, he enrolled at UC Berkeley as a freshman to study architecture. But the timing was unfortunate. He started as a freshman in September 1941.
Uh-oh.
And in December, the Japanese, of course, bombed Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
And eventually, not immediately, but soon after that, the United States began to impound the Japanese Americans on the three West Coast states, Washington, Oregon, and California. And so Gio and his family were to be impounded, but he found that the law allowed him to continue his education if he left the West Coast. Wasn't allowed to study at Berkeley anymore.
Really?
And, well, he had to leave. The country was afraid that the Japanese would collaborate with Imperial Japan in an invasion of our West Coast. That was the thought about it. Seems ludicrous today, but it was a scary time for people. That was the wartime. So
right.
Gio applied to schools in the Midwest and in the East and was rejected by all of them, including my alma mater, Illinois. But Little Washington University in St. Louis, private school with a good architecture department, accepted him. And he got the telegram showing his acceptance at the university the day before he would have been shipped with his parents and his sister to the camps in the Sierras.
Wow.
So he just got out of town just in time. And he tells a great story of got on the train. I don't think he had ever been on the east side of the Sierra Nevada mountains. He got on the train in Oakland, and no buildings were brick. And as the further east he went, the fewer stucco buildings there were, and the more brick buildings there were, until finally when he arrived in St. Louis, all the buildings were brick.
Well, the ground is a little more stable in the Midwest.
Yes, yeah. So Washington University, they were amazing people. They adopted Gio and embraced him, made him feel comfortable. And he fell in love with the university and the city of St. Louis. And he's still living today. He's in 96, I believe, and he still lives in that area. He could live anywhere he wants. He actually designed and built a house back in Oakland, near where he grew up, and lived in it part-time, but finally was not comfortable, went back to his beloved St. Louis. So he had the harder time. Yama was older, had already left the West Coast, Yama was recruited, as I said, by Hellmuth to work at Smith Hinchman at Grills as a designer. Hellmuth knew that they could get more work if they had a better quality of designer. So when Hellmuth decided to break away from Smith Hinchman and took Yamasaki and Joe Lineweber, who was a production architect at Smith Hinchman, and formed his own firm with 3 partners. And because Hellmuth had this strategy about diversifying the practices to the maximum extent possible, don't just learn how to design tall buildings or school buildings or churches, learn how to design everything. And you have a better chance of not running out of work. All of these founders were affected by the Great Depression. Hellmuth graduated from college in 1930, just at the beginning of the Great Depression. So Obata was actually, he went to SOM Chicago. He also went to Cranbrook. And there he met the Saarinens, he met a lot of other people. And I think there was a group that tended to know each other from having been in that Cranbrook environment, which was founded by Elio Saarinen, Arrow's father. And Yamasaki knew these people as well. And so when he got very busy with work at Hellmuth, Yamasaki, and Lineweber, this new firm, they got a lot of work. He needed an assistant and asked John Dinkeloo, who eventually, was the successor firm to
Roche Dinkeloo, right.
Roche and Dinkeloo, asked him, I need a good designer. And Dinkeloo said, there's this great Japanese-American designer working for SOM Chicago. You should hire him. And he did. And so Gio was hired as Yama's assistant, and Lineweber needed an assistant. They opened a St. Louis branch, in accordance with Hellmuth's strategy of you diversify with what you know how to design, plus you diversify geographically. If Detroit is slow, maybe St. Louis will be busy and we'll be able to keep our employees busy. That to him was paramount. You keep the talent in your firm. You don't let them go after the job finishes. You keep them going.
Right.
So Lineweber hired this guy named George Cassabaum, who was a faculty member at Washington University, as his assistant in St. Louis. Yamasaki was flying back and forth from Detroit to St. Louis. St. Louis ended up having more work than Detroit, but Yama was uncomfortable with the travel. He wasn't in good health. So he hired Obata, started with Obata in Detroit, and finally shipped Gio to St. Louis, where Gio had studied. And Gio finally met George Cassabaum. He actually knew him in school, but met George Hellmuth. So the 3 founders of HOK were then in one city, St. Louis, an unlikely place to start a world firm.
Bill, as the firm solidified in 1955, what was its breakout project? What were the projects that really kind of put it on the map in the late 50s, early 60s?
Well, probably the one that put it on the map the most was a little chapel called the Priory Chapel. And Gio worked on it with Pierluigi Nervi, and it's a concrete shell. And it's just a beautiful, beautiful little gem of a building, but it ended up in the centerfold of Life magazine. And that was like the platform. If you wanted to get publicity for a firm, that was the platform for it, because in those days, people who weren't architects didn't read any of the architectural press, but they all read Life.
Yeah.
And so to be in the middle of Life,
it was like a hard
really,
copy Instagram.
Absolutely. And so that really took off. And today, that is still one of the most beautiful, elegant, simple structures in St. Louis.
And it has those undulating roof pattern, very thin shell concrete, right?
They're all a series of parabolic arches, not dissimilar to the arch that came much later to define St. Louis. But it was really 3 tiers of radiating parabolic arches that came together in a really beautiful, simple groin vault on the interior. And one of the things that actually is really wonderful about it is they ran out of money. And they were going to have stained glass in all the windows, and there was no money for that. And so they ended up using a product which people really didn't like very much because they considered it to be too inexpensive and this and that, called Calwall. And Calwall in its early days had this problem that it started out kind of off-white and turned yellow. So they put in Calwall instead of the stained glass. And what happened is it took on the color of onyx. And it's just this most beautiful golden color, which turned out to be much more beautiful than any of the stained glass windows that could have been there, because as the sun moves across the sky, and if you're drifting off a little during a sermon, you can watch the shadows against the cow wall made by these Curbach arches, and it's just extraordinary.
What a happy accident.
Yeah.
And then later on, I think it's around 1968, Bill, HOK gets an enormous commission, the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport.
Dallas-Fort Worth Airport, which, it really interesting commission. Stanley Marcus of Neiman Marcus was really almost the client rep on this one, and it was all about convenience for the client, convenience for the customer. And the airport was designed about 2 years too early because it represented an aviation program that now is completely extinct. But the idea was you would park your car and you never had to walk further than 2 747 lengths to get to your gate. And then you went through. And shortly thereafter, the airline started doing hubbing, which meant you'd go from one gate to another, and that kind of broke down the system. And then when security came, the whole thing completely changed, and the diagram, which was so exquisite originally, really didn't make as much sense. But it was a spectacular project, almost Egyptian in scale. I believe that one was in Time magazine, and there was an aerial photograph of the entire airport under construction, and nobody had seen anything that big and impressive before.
I believe it's the size of Manhattan.
Probably.
No. Really?
I don't think
I've always heard that comparison.
That is actually correct. The airport property, they picked a site midway between downtown Dallas and downtown Fort Worth, which aren't more than, 60 miles apart or so. And at that time, it was all open land, and they bought a lot of land and put the airport on it. So it's quite spread out with lots of distance between runways and so on. And we used to have a drawing that we were all very proud of showing the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport outline of the land they owned with a picture of Manhattan Island under it or inside of it. So it easily exceeded Manhattan in size. Of course, today it's all built up all around it. So there's fortunately for the airport, they bought so much land in the beginning that they've had no problem in expanding.
I remember seeing it from the air as like 3 half arcs or 3 half circles. Am I remembering?
Correct.
Yeah. And it was
very distinctive. Of the 8 that were proposed.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Yeah. No, they make no small plans in Texas.
Right. I guess not.
And how many have they built so far? 5?
Well, they then left the ARC program and took on different forms as the airline industry changed completely. So it would be the equivalent of 5 or 6.
Okay. And was the People Mover part of the original design, the train to get everyone around?
No, because there was no, the way the airline industry worked in those days, it was all point to point. You didn't transfer from one to the X. And that's why this whole idea of parking, walking 2 airplane lengths, and being at your gate made so much sense, and then stopped making sense when they changed the way people flew around the United States.
And after deregulation.
Yeah.
Only old folks remember that.
But it's interesting, these great big projects have really defined us, those and the little ones. But, after that, we then did King Saud University, which was at the time the largest architectural commission in history. And then 15 years after that, we did something called KAUST, which was a university that we had to build in 32 months from when they said, start designing, to when they wanted to have the ribbon cutting. And the university was a 5.5 million square foot structure of research primarily, which is tough buildings to build. And it had another 10 million square feet of a town and city that supported all of that.
Where is this?
It's in Jeddah.
Oh, in Saudi Arabia.
In Saudi Arabia.
Arabia. And what we ended up doing, we lashed together 7 HOK offices in order just to even do it. And we started the whole process with what we called the Chasing the Sun charrette. It started in Hong Kong, then it moved to London, then it moved to New York, then to St. Louis, then to Los Angeles, and then back to Hong Kong, and went around the world 3 times, which is a terrible way to design anything. but was a wonderful way to design the team. And it taught the team how to work together.
And this is all before Zoom and, Google Meet, all these things.
Well before that. We were inventing our own tools, working with Cisco and others with their telepresence systems and so forth to really do the collaboration between the offices.
When we come back, we'll talk more about airports and also some of the specific accomplishments the firm has made over the years.
And back by popular demand, the outer space adventures of modernist realtor Angela Roll. Episode 4, A New Hope. It is a time of unrest as bulldozers from the evil galactic empire destroy millions of modernist homes. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, rebel spies stole plans for the empire's ultimate weapon, the Giga Mansion, a house so large it can wipe out entire planets. Wanted by the Imperial fleet, Princess Angela Roll flies her converted DeLorean to meet Empire spies in a sushi restaurant on SETI Alpha 5. Try the eel. Will this clandestine meeting work out, or will it be a trap?
It's a trap!
Meanwhile, back on Earth, circa 2020, the princess's ancestor, modernist realtor Angela Roll, uses the force of her real estate experience and architectural training to specialize in advising buyers and sellers on everything, from appropriate renovation to where to find the best sushi. Angela Roll is your very special agent. Reach her at 919-995-0550 or angelaroll.com. That's ROEHL. Or just send a hologram.
Welcome back. We're talking with Bill Hellmuth and Patrick MacLeamy of HOK, one of the most successful architecture firms in the history of everything, really. I have a question for you guys. Tell us, mere mortals, what BIM is, without using any words over 3 syllables. Who wants to take this question?
Patrick does.
Well, I'll take that. I was trained classically. Bill, I think you were too. And classically means we learned how to draw buildings think about buildings. They're all in 3 dimensions. They have length, they have width, and they have height. And we learned how to draw 3-dimensional buildings on 2-dimensional sheets of paper. And, why do that? Well, because that was the state of the art. That was the best way that anyone knew how to actually describe something in 3 dimensions, because we had no idea of making a model of a building. We made study models, things out of cardboard or glued together, but the things that the contractor used. So now along comes the computer, and we've learned with the computer that we can actually make 3-dimensional models of buildings in the computer, on the computer, and study the building in all 3 dimensions at once. You have to get used to it, but it's a much better process for really thoroughly understanding the building.
And this was a successor to CAD, computer-aided design, right? Which was also somewhat 2-dimensional.
CAD was really computer-aided drafting.
Okay.
It was a drafting by computer. It draws a nice straight line, but it's still drafting. And so BIM is really a different, it's a departure, and a wonderful departure.
Patrick, I read that HOK was one of the very early adopters of CAD in the early 80s. I think more so than almost any other major firm in the country. Is that right?
Yes. There's a story behind it, as there is behind many things. The world of CAD was finally dawning in the early 90s, late 80s. And Geo was shown a demonstration of ArchiCAD, which was by Autodesk. It's a 2-dimensional CAD system. He said, well, that's fine, but that's something that helps you draft. I want something that helps people design. And there wasn't anything. So he ended up hiring a group of very talented technical people, IT people, and actually was able to develop one of the earliest versions of 3-dimensional design software. It was christened HOK Draw. Today it would look pretty clunky, but then it was like magic. And HOK used that for designing for many years, but then found that the software companies, which were in the software business, were far more adept at getting their software updated than we were. So even though HOK Draw continued to be in use We even sold some of it to other architects for a while. We finally decided that we were really in the architecture business, not in the software business, and gave it away, or shut it off, I should say.
But that was really something to adopt technology that early on such a scale for a firm, because I know many architecture firms didn't jump into this until maybe the very late 80s, early 90s.
That's right. Again, that's a hallmark of the firm, trying things to see what we could make happen. And you'll find that, time and again with the founders. They innovated all the way along, even before the computer, looking for better ways to work. And of course, it did mean some of our innovations were pretty good, and some were, let's say, not as good as they should have been. But yes, that's one of the hallmarks of the firm.
But, one thing I was going to say that was really remarkable to me is the way technology is speeding up. For my kids, they can't imagine life before cell phones. It probably didn't exist in their world. And with BIM and CAD and all the various things, if you went back to Palladio or Thomas Jefferson and you showed them the drafting tools that I started in school with, they'd know what to do. They were pretty much the same drafting tools all the way back to Cheops, building the pyramids.
Jefferson was very cutting edge.
Yeah, I know. But they hadn't changed in all that time. And if you then look, in the last 30 years, no one uses a T-square anymore. You have to go to an antique store to go find one, or a triangle, or any of the Leroy lettering sets, or all of those things.
I remember those.
Completely on the up in the attic someplace.
Do you think they'll ever come back?
Oh God, I hope not. Those Leroy sets were just awful.
Yeah, I remember you could always get ink everywhere on those sets.
Well, it was usually just at the last thing that you lettered.
Oh.
You'd hit a little clot of ink and it would go all over your drawing.
After the DFW Airport bill, which was an astonishing commission, I mean, just the scale of it still is amazing. Your firm really made its mark in airports and have done a lot of them since. What are some of the airports around the world you've done?
Oh, God. We did big pieces of Dulles. We expanded Dulles at one point. We did the first midfield terminal out at Dulles. We did in Riyadh, the airport there in Saudi Arabia. We did the Doha airport, which was probably bigger, certainly bigger in terms of gates than Dallas-Fort Worth was even aspiring to being at that time. And then a lot of much smaller airports. We did a wonderful airport in Long Beach, California, where the waiting rooms are outside because the weather never gets bad.
Right.
And just a whole series of them.
What are some of the interesting challenges of doing a new airport? Because it seems like that there was a period of time, I guess from about 1980 to maybe 2000, where a lot of the airports that were built, I'm not saying yours, but others, were kind of bland. And then they started getting interesting again in the 2000s.
Well, actually, I wouldn't say bland.
Okay.
I would hold up Saarinen's Dulles Airport to just about any airport that's ever been built.
But that was much earlier. Yeah.
Much earlier. Yeah. And then they became just sort of a way for you to get onto an airplane. And then what happened is more people had to switch planes and they had time in the airport. What's happening now is they really became a place to hang out in. They became a place of retail. They became a place that you could eat. They became a place that you would want to spend some time in.
Well, especially if you wind up with a flight that's suddenly delayed 5 hours and you got to do something.
And in addition to that, they really became places of civic pride, especially, you get in the Middle East and one country's airport has to outdo the next country's airport and so forth. And it happens less so in Europe, but in different places, the airport becomes, in part, a symbol of the city. It's as important to the city in terms of imagery as the Brooklyn Bridge was to New York when it was built. These things which are all about transportation and gateway and so forth take on a significance, an architectural and cultural significance wherever they are. And it's just because so many people go through them.
Well, all right, let's get to LaGuardia and its number one fan, Joe Biden, who famously said this in 2016.
And I mean this. A lot of you have traveled, or I've traveled 800,000 miles just since being vice president. And I've traveled millions of miles around the world. I've been in almost every country in the world. If I blindfolded someone and took him at 2 o'clock in the morning into the airport in Hong Kong and said, "Where do you think you are?" They said, "This must be America. It's a modern airport." If I took him blindfolded and took to the LaGuardia Airport in New York, you must think I must be in some third world country.
Was it before this or after this, guys, that New York decided to actually improve LaGuardia?
It was probably before this. When did you say that was? You said that was 2016.
Yeah.
So it was certainly before that. I mean, LaGuardia was the airport itself. It sort of got a bad rap. I always used to actually rather like it because I lived on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, and I could get there in 10 minutes. And everything worked if you were catching a morning flight, which I often did. And it worked when you catch the flight coming back. But then it got overcrowded and had really nothing much done to keep it up. And again, the world passed it by. And so they realized we need to do a new scheme. So they basically came up with a plan that had an indicative design of what to do. And they came up with a plan for a P3, public-private partnership piece. And our client was LaGuardia Gateway Partners. And we developed a scheme. Everyone knew it would just be horribly, horribly inconvenient during the construction process because, it was a tiny little piece of site that, it wasn't like the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport that had miles to work with. It had a little postage stamp of a site. And if you were going to build something over here, you had to take something else out of commission over there. And if you followed the indicative design, you'd sort of build something, take something down, build something else, take something down. And we came in with a scheme that said, leave the existing horseshoe building there for a period of time, and we're going to build around it. We'll build a head house on one side of it where the old garage used to be, and we'll build concourses that are like midfield concourses on the water side of it, which is where where the taxiways and so forth are. And you'll enter through 400-foot long bridges. So you leave the head house, you go up in the air, go across, you take in that magnificent view of Manhattan, and then come down into what is a midfield terminal. Now, midfield terminals became very popular because they're very efficient and effective in terms of moving aircraft in and out. So we ended up with a much more efficient layout and way of moving the aircraft around. But we also were able to peel a year off of the construction time because we didn't have to build a little, chop down a little, build a little, chop down a little. We were able to build it like building a ship in a bottle, build around the existing terminal and then get it all set and then one day simply remove it. And so that's what the design is all about. It's a head house, these two great bridges which go to two midfield terminals. And, they're occupying pieces of it as we speak.
A lot of people don't know that outside of New York, that some of it's already open. I've been in some of the new portion, and it's really beautiful.
Yeah, hopefully it's going to change Biden's perspective of air travel in New York City.
And what is a head house?
Well, the head house is where you come in and you get your ticket, your baggage is returned to you there. It's kind of the reception end.
Front office operations.
Side.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
I just never heard it called that.
Bill, here's the $64 billion question, though. Is the subway ever going to connect to this thing?
Yes. There's a whole timeline. It's all part of the master plan. I can't tell you the exact dates, but yes, it will.
Really?
Yeah.
Because it seems like that's been such a missing feature for so long.
Oh, yeah. No. It's part of the design is all about that rail connection, which is extremely important.
It seemed like it took a long time to get JFK hooked up. And that finally happened, 10 years ago, maybe?
And only kind of.
Yeah.
It'll be a lot more convenient to get to LaGuardia.
Well, that sounds fascinating. And I have to say that despite all the problems of building an airport around an airport, I've flown out of there 30 times in the last 2 years. And you guys have done a good job with all the scheduling and making it happen.
Well, thank you. But listen, while we're talking about LaGuardia, I've got to put a plug in for one of my favorite aviation buildings in the world, which is the Marine Air Terminal at LaGuardia.
Oh, yes, on the other side of the field. Yes.
It was where the Pan Am Clipper, it was a little circular building, and it had a frieze. It was an Art Deco building, had a frieze of flying fish, which is what the Pan Am Clipper was nicknamed. And it went out to 2 docks out in the river. And you started in the rotunda, and you went out on this jetty that would go out and get out one of the 2 docks where the Pan Am Clipper was sitting there waiting to whisk you off to Europe via Newfoundland, Iceland, Greenland, and every stop along the way because it couldn't fly very far.
What's there now?
One of the shuttles is there. I can't remember whether it was...
The city shuttles. I think it's the one going to Washington, D.C. every hour.
But there's no...
Oh, yeah. It goes to Washington and to Boston every hour, but I can't remember which airline.
But there's no jetty anymore.
No. You can only see they've got a wonderful little exhibit in the old rotunda showing how the Pan Am Clipper worked, and the aerial photograph of showing the dock and the jetty and all of that sort of thing. It's really kind of wonderful insight into when this whole idea was brand new. And it was an experiment. Flying boats turned out to be not a very good idea.
Yeah.
But they tried it.
They did try it. Patrick, we've talked about some of the successes of HOK. In your book, you chronicle some of the failures, some of the ideas that didn't work for the firm.
Yes.
What were those?
Well, we actually used to keep a list of our biggest failures. I won't share that with you. It was a very long list. But I can say that when you have the courage to try things, that the firm wanted to grow, it wanted to be big because the founders and the later leaders believed that if it was big, it could compete for the biggest, most complicated, most difficult projects in the world. And that's what the firm has become. But along the way, we grew too fast. And we ended up with, at a certain point in time, a coalition of offices instead of a firm. And we had to set that right. Actually, Bill Hellmuth and I got very deeply involved in that, re-gluing the firm back together so that it became one firm like it was when I joined HOK all those years before. Of all the things, I think that's the biggest thing that strikes me. The theory was right, and so on. What wasn't right was always the execution. If you're going to build a great firm, you have to build it with a good strategy. And Hellmuth had this diversity strategy. Let's learn how to do everything. Let's be all over the world, and let's specialize. Let's have people like his partner Obata was specialized on design. You got to remember, in the early days of the firm, that wasn't true. Most firms, the partners of the firm, first they weren't a corporation, but HOK was. But old partnerships would do everything. They would get the work, they would design the work, they would supervise the team to produce the work and oversee construction, and then they go out and find another job. And Hellmuth's idea was, which I think is one of the best things that we did, he said, let's have people focus on doing things again and again, exclusively, and they'll get really good at it. But he wanted to focus on marketing. He got Gio Obata, first Yama, and then Obata to focus on just designing, and George Casimov just production, and so on. Lots of slips and mishaps along the way, but basically a really good strategy overall. Just the glory and the tragedy of it is the execution. If you execute it right with the right people, it's a winning combination. But we had times when we had the people in the wrong places and so on.
One of the buildings of yours that I've been to many times, and most people won't get to go here because it's private, but it's really exceptional for its use. I think it's one of the best examples of form follows function, and that's the Boeing Leadership Training Center outside of St. Louis. I think you guys worked on that, right?
Absolutely, yes.
Tell our listeners about how that building is structured for a particular purpose.
Well, it actually started with McDonnell Douglas, and then Boeing bought them, and it became the Boeing Leadership Center. But it became a place where everyone in the organization would spend 2 weeks there and live there and study there and learn about the culture and the sort of business model for Boeing. And it became really a major part of their educational program of how any executive within Boeing or any of the chief engineers or so forth would work together and collaborate and make things happen. One of the things that I always found interesting is on the site of a great old historic mansion, limestone mansion called Vouziers. And Vouziers, and it's just set off to the right-hand side of the lawn of Vouziers, which overlooks the bluffs of the Missouri River. And underneath this great lawn that rolls down is an underground ballroom for Vouziers, which was designed by my great-uncle, Harry Hellmuth of Hellmuth and Hellmuth, which was the precursor firm to Hellmuth, Yamasaki, and Weinweber, and Hellmuth, Obot, and Casabon. You know, they basically did houses in St. Louis and a few churches at the turn of the century, and did a lot of the great houses in Portland, Westmoreland Place. But this was one of Uncle Harry's projects, which was this great underground ballroom, which then opened up through the bluff out to that magnificent view. And the Boeing Leadership Center is just to the right of that. And so it's all part of the same compound.
That's really cool.
And the new part of the building outside of the mansion that was already there has a general shape of an airplane.
Well, it's actually not dissimilar to LaGuardia's shape. It has a head house that has these fingers which stick out over the bluff and taking in this absolutely spectacular view.
It's pretty incredible. It really is. And I just wanted to thank you guys for doing that, because the experience of going in that building is just delightful.
Well, thank you. It was a great project.
Bill, there are a lot of famous Hellmuths that we've talked about here. Are you any relation to Phil Hellmuth, the poker player?
No. In fact,
no.
I'm a terrible poker player. Hopefully, I'm a better architect.
Oh, he would love to play you then.
Yes, he would.
Patrick, I understand one time that an HOK executive was mistaken for royalty on a trip to Saudi Arabia.
Yes, that's right. The first marketing assistant to George Hellmuth was recruited at HOK very soon after the firm was founded. Probably the firm started in 55. He probably came in 56 or maybe 57. And his name was Horace Kingsland Graf. His family were German Americans, came from the Alsace-Lorraine region of Germany that sometimes was French and sometimes was German. Right. His uncle was an architect. His father was an artist. And he said, with a name like Horace Kingsland Graf, Horace was his father's name and Kingsland was his mother's maiden name, there wasn't much choice for me to have a first name except Horace Kingsland or HK, and I picked King. So everybody called him King.
Ah.
And what happened is that he went to Saudi Arabia and went into a hotel that he had booked a reservation and went to the desk clerk. And the desk clerk, may I help you? Yes. I have a reservation. My name is King Graf. And the desk clerk was horrified. He said, Your Highness, we didn't know you were coming. No one told us. And he snapped his fingers and, bellboys and everybody else came running until King could finally straighten him out and say, I'm not really a royalty. I'm just an architect with the name King. But that was the story.
They didn't upgrade his room then?
I don't think so.
Maybe a king bed.
Yeah, there you go.
Guys, thank you both. This has been a real pleasure. I just have one final question, very important to me. Can either of you introduce me to Bjarke Ingels? Because, I'm just a fanboy, and I would love to have him on the show.
What would give us that idea?
Anyway, thank you so much for being with us, and hopefully we'll talk with you again soon.
Well, thank you, George.
Thank you, George.
George has been talking to Patrick MacLeamy and Bill Hellmuth, past and current CEOs of HOK. And now, a few minutes with architect Frank Harmon. He's been a special friend to U.S. Modernist, and architects go crazy to attend his sketching seminars all over the country. Frank reads from his new book, Native Places, with observations on life and space and nature based on the sketches he's so famous for.
A rug in the window. Every Tuesday morning at 8 o'clock, My neighbor across the street opens her second-floor window and shakes a carpet outside. My heart leaps for joy. I live on a street of houses built before 1941, when people were tough and resourceful. They cooled their houses by opening the windows at night. The sounds of crickets and nighthawks entered through the curtains. Then air conditioning arrived and a whole technology of home design and decor disappeared. Lace curtains and shutters were obsolete. So were paperweights and paper fans, insect screens and flypaper. We were happy to see them go, but we stopped sitting out on the porch at night. As a result, no one opens the windows anymore, and our houses look as though they had glaucoma. That's why I'm thrilled when my neighbor opens her window. There's life on our street. Today, houses are bigger and tighter with windows that rarely open, but hope is at hand. New ways of building include old-fashioned windows because outdoor air is cleaner than indoor air.
Thanks for listening. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Angela Roll, your special real estate agent for modernist houses, and by Nichiha.com/US Modernist.
Visit usmodernist.org's massive archives to listen to past shows, discover documentation of 7,000 significant modernist houses, and access 2.8 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song was performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl. Carrie Cesarina researches guests while juggling 2 children, a bowling ball, and a chainsaw, and salsa dancing with her husband Adam. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild. George and I'll be back soon with another Titans of Industry edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.